Hi, I'm Charlene Collins Freeman, and welcome to Painting an Autumn Wreath in Watercolors. For this project, I'm practicing first on student grade paper, and the most important supply I have are my brushes. These are not expensive brushes. They are rounds and they have a really nice tip on them. These particular brushes are the Princeton Series 4050. And I'm using a size 6 for the smaller details and a size 16 for the bigger. I want to start off with a little bit of practice. We're going to be painting flowers that look like roses and flowers that look like sunflowers. But these can be really loosely painted, and you can interpret them to be whatever flowers you want. My color choices are slanting more towards the deep reds, oranges, and yellows for these flowers, something that I associate with autumn. Feel free to use whatever colors you want. As I start the rose, I started in the interior with these two little marks that almost look like commas hugging each other. And I'm making brush strokes that are getting progressively bigger as I paint away from the center. I found that I like the flowers much more when I leave quite a bit of white paper, as I'm doing here, between the petals. That gives me room to come in later with a damp brush and soften some of these colors and paint right over some of these white shapes, but not all of them. The center of my flowers will be darker, and then as I pull away, I'll get lighter and lighter. Sometimes I'm just painting with water and barely touching the paint that's already on my paper so that it bleeds into the watery petals. Giving my flowers a darker center seems to give them a nicer three-dimensional look. As I practice these brush strokes and these shapes, I'm also playing with my colors. Some will blend together better than others. So I always like to practice a few ideas first before I commit to my wreath. I'll zoom in a little bit closer so you can see these brush strokes. They're not perfectly round, and they are like little commas that are getting bigger and bigger. As I paint away from the center, my paint gets more watery, which makes it lighter. Sometimes I have my commas, which are really petals, touch the previous brush strokes, and sometimes I just leave the white of the paper between the brush strokes. And I'm creating these flower shapes. Because I'm painting pretty watery, I have time to go in and drop in color before it all dries. When I drop in color, I'm mostly looking to add some of the darker colors in the center of the flower. But you can also play with dropping in different colors altogether. I'm starting a third one, and you can see the process I go through. This time I reached into a different puddle of paint. I went from alizarin crimson to quinacridone gold. And I'm letting them blend together on the paper. I'm not mixing the colors. If you look at my palette, I have 4 little puddles of colors, but none of them are mixed together on my palette. They can mix on the paper beautifully. Every time I need to reload my brush, I just go into a different puddle of color. When I look at the rose at this point, when most of it is painted, I start to see if there are too many white shapes or if they're too big, and I just drag a little bit of brush through them. That first flower is still just slightly damp, and I can add dark paint to the center like I'm doing to this most recent flower. And I'll do the same with the purple flower. For that one, I'll drop in darker purple. Now that I've painted a few of them for you, it's your turn to practice. I also want to practice the yellow flowers. For these, I pick up my bigger brush. And I want these flowers to be interesting as well. I don't want just one flat yellow. So I mix a bit of quinacridone gold and then a separate puddle of transparent pyrrole orange and then a lighter yellow. Mine is Hansa Yellow Light. And again, you can see here I have 3 separate puddles of color. Also, if you look at my puddles, they're not really watery. They're not so watered down that they just look like slightly dirty water. They've got a lot of paint in them. This is referred to as juicy paint, and you definitely want to paint with juicy paint. If on the other extreme your puddles look really dry on your palette, you need to add both more water and more paint to them. Notice that as I paint these yellow petals, I'm using my entire brush. You don't have to do that. If you want to outline each petal and color it in, you can, but you have to work quickly. You don't want those outlines to dry and then have it be a outlined petal. I'm also using these different yellows and oranges to create more variety. This flower is entirely in Hansa Yellow Light, and you can see how it's a little bit more boring than the 2 I did previously with all the different colors. That's not a big problem. While it's wet, you can come in and drop in some other colors on top of it. Or if it's completely dry, you can just do another layer of watery color on top of some of those petals to slightly shift the color in them. I want to give my yellow flowers a dark center, a mix of brown and purple. Notice that when I painted my yellow flowers, I didn't have all the petals meet in the middle. I left a circle of white paper. And for my center, I come in and I just put a few dots of this dark mix. If I paint the entire white center a really dark color, it could look kind of heavy. And I think letting the white of the paper show through keeps it light and fresh looking. It's okay if when I'm painting these brown centers, they touch the slightly damp petal still. There might be a little bit of mingling of colors. That can look really pretty. If you find that your dark paint is totally flooding your yellow flower, you can lift out that brown paint with a damp brush and use it more like a sponge than a brush. And then you can repaint your yellow. I left a lot of space between my petals, so I've decided to go back in and paint in some smaller petals in between the bigger ones, just to fill out the flowers a bit. I'm trying to make all my petals a little bit different than each other, like they really would appear in flowers. Again, if the colors mix and blend, that's okay. I think that adds to the beauty of watercolors. So here I've decided to add some orange and some quinacridone gold to that flower that was entirely Hansa Yellow Light earlier. I try not to overstroke every petal. I just put in a few colors, a few brush strokes, and I get out and leave it alone. While we're at it, it might be good to practice a few leaf shapes. I think the biggest challenge with leaves is that we don't make the points neat. In other words, they end up having almost 2 points on each side of the leaf as our brush strokes crisscross instead of meeting at a point. So practice a few leaf strokes. And while you're at it, you can mix your green with either yellow or brown or purple and get different shades of green. Since we're doing an autumn wreath, I'm not going to do a lot of bright yellow-green leaves. Those are more indicative of spring. So with these autumn leaves, I'm sticking to sap green and adding some brown into them or purple. You could also make yellow and orange leaves. Now it's your turn to practice again. Then we'll start our wreath. The first thing I do is I grab a salad plate to give myself a pencil outline of a perfect circle. This is really the only drawing I'll do on the wreath. Everything else I'll make up as I paint. I'm using 140-pound cold press paper. It's a student grade sketchbook, so nothing special. And again, I use my Princeton 4050 series brush. They have really nice tips on them. And that helps me get started with the small little brush strokes of my first rows. I rinse out my brush just to make the color a little lighter than that dark center. I add some quinacridone gold to my alizarin crimson, and I start adding petals like I did in our practice. I noticed that I left a lot of white of the paper in the center of mine, so I come in and just stroke in a couple of more brush strokes. Again, I make my paint much more wet as I pull out from the center. It gives these flowers an airiness and a freshness to them. Be sure you leave white specks of paper in between some of these petals and shapes. For this particular wreath, I'm just putting one rose, but I've done other wreaths with many more roses and they always look good. So feel free to make as many roses as you want on your wreath. I use the same colors that are already in my flower to create just a few leaf shapes around my penciled circle. When you do this, be sure they're all pointing in different directions. Make them different sizes and shapes. In addition to the yellowy ones, now I'm adding orange. With the alizarin crimson, I add little dots to represent cranberries. I'm designing this as I go. I don't really have an ultimate plan in mind. But I find that by doing a flower or two and then adding a couple of leaves, then adding a couple of berries, it starts to build up nicely. Using different yellows, I'm going to put in those sunflowers. For my second sunflower, I picked up some slightly thicker quinacridone gold, so it'll be slightly different than the first sunflower I painted. And I'm painting these two right next to each other, but you can really place your flowers wherever you want. Before I add the center of these sunflowers, I'll let them dry a little bit more so that whatever dark paint I use for the center doesn't flood them. While I'm waiting, I go and paint a few green leaves to add to my yellow and red leaves. And I go back to adding some alizarin crimson cranberries. I'm just looking for spaces where they fit nicely or where there's too much white and I want to fill it in. So then I go back to my leaves and I'll work my way through this wreath with leaves and berries. Before I fill it up too much, I will mix up some brown, and mine is burnt sienna, to paint in the woody vines. I'm using my smaller brush for these vines because I don't want them to get too thick. I weave my way through the berries and the leaves I've already painted. Just like I wanted variety in my leaf colors and also in the petals of my flowers, I want variety in this brown that I'm using for the vines. Here you can see from that tiny puddle that you see on my palette that my paint is pretty thick, and when I paint, it shows up dark. And now I'm adding just a bit of purple to it. And that will make a slightly different dark brown for another layer of vines. This will also be the same mix that I use for the centers of my sunflowers. I'm going in and connecting some of those berries and leaves to the vines with these small brown strokes. By using the same color in the centers of the sunflowers, it really ties in the vines to the rest of the wreath we've painted so far. Just like when we practiced, I don't paint a solid round brown center on these flowers, but rather I leave little flecks of white paper to show through. I use yellow ochre to create another layer of leaves. I paint some darker green leaves using my undersea green. If you don't have undersea green, you can add a purple or a blue to a sap green. If the paint you're using is too dry, you won't get any nice saturated colors. So be sure to give yourself plenty of paint and water in your mixes. You can see how saturated the colors are in my palette. Now that I have more leaves in place, it's time to add some more berries. I could stop here, but I really want to fill up my wreath. So I paint in some more leaves oranges and yellows, greens, yellow ochres. I just want to fill this up. The centers of my sunflowers are dry now, and the sunflowers were completely dry when I added them. So they really have a hard edge of brown against yellow. So I decide to go in with a wet brush and really watery transparent pyrrole orange and soften up the transition between that brown center and my petals. I also add in a little bit more color to these petals to make them more interesting. They seem kind of flat and uniform to me. In some areas, I'm lifting paint out to make those petals lighter. With some thicker quinacridone gold, I add some dark brush marks to some of the petals. And then I'll come in with a slightly damp brush and soften them up. You see me constantly wiping the brush off on my towel so that as I soften up these edges, I'm not just redistributing the paint I just picked up, but rather I'm washing it right off with my towel. I do a similar application to the top sunflower. I want to soften the center of this flower as well, and then I'll be done fussing with them. With so many warm yellows, oranges, and reds, I think a touch of something cool would be nice. And I paint in these spiky purple flowers. They remind me of sage flowers. To paint them, I just use a thin brush stroke to suggest the stem. And then I dot my way down the stem, getting wider as I work my way down from the top. As the flowers and leaves and berries are starting to fill in the wreath, I feel like the vine needs to be sturdier. I'm going to paint in a few more strands. I weave my brush around the strands I've already painted. Sometimes I stop and start around the leaves and around the berries, and sometimes I paint right over them. As I paint the different strands of vine, I'm not concerned about matching the same brown. In fact, I think it looks better if the browns of the different strands of the vine are slightly different, lighter or darker. I also paint in a few branches that don't look like they're tucked into the rest of the vine. Now I'm just working my way through the wreath one more time, looking for areas that seem bare. As I paint the leaves, I keep in mind that I want a variety in color, sizes, shapes, and the directions that they're facing. As I fill out the wreath with more leaves, I keep changing from yellows to oranges to reds, light green, and dark green. And then I go in for the smaller areas and fill them up with more berries. I connect the berries and leaves that aren't attached to the wreath with very thin brown brush strokes. I water down my brown considerably and weave one more strand of vine through the wreath. And I think I'm pretty close to done. Thanks for joining me. I hope all your pumpkin latte dreams come true.